All right. So now that we talked about the kind of history of whiteness, now we're going to kind of jump into the culture of whiteness, and more of like how this culture plays out today. So this next section is just going to be talking about different ways that it plays out. Um, I want to read just the first top line of this. It's a really cool quote. Whiteness is not divorced from race. Whiteness is not neutral. Whiteness is loaded and always ready to fire, yet whiteness moves through the world claiming the exclusive right to wear the cloak labeled humanity. And that's really important to understand. Like a lot of times we feel like, like especially people in that non-racist category where, we don't use the N-word. We don't, support the KKK. Maybe we show up to some rallies, but that's it. Or maybe we just want to stay neutral. I mean, when whiteness is created as the top part of a racial hierarchy, so just by staying neutral, just by perpetuating the status quo in itself is perpetuating white supremacy. So it's just important to understand there is no neutral in this scenario. So I'm going to start out with another video on from John Powell, another really great professor that I'm blanking his school, but he did this is from the 2019 the anti-black something symposium, but he does a really great speech kind of talking about how the anti-blackness of white culture.
A very important but also very complicated subject. I was teaching a class several years ago, and I started off the class in terms of taking indigenous land in the United States. And some of my white students at some point, I forget what the name of the class was. It wasn't a class about Native people. It wasn't a class about indigenous people. So one of the white students raised his hand. He said, "Professor Powell, why do we have to study the history of Native Americans? That's not what this course is about." My response was, we're not. We know nothing about Native Americans. This is the history of the United States. This is your history. This is your origin story. It starts with taking the land of a people and enslaving another people. Now, the land that you take tells you nothing about the people. The people you enslave tells you nothing about those people. It tells you about yourself. It tells you this is your origin story. So really, every white American, every white Brazilian needs to understand slavery, not because you're going to understand Africa, but it's the origin story of Brazil. It's the origin story of the United States. And so part of the turn in terms of understanding anti-black violence is that anti-black violence is about both state building. This is how we build a state. This is how we constitute a nation. By first of all, being clear on who's excluded. We draw boundaries, not by just who's in, but who's out. And those who are in, how we exclude and exploit some in favor of others. So in terms of understanding anti-black violence, I would posit that what we're really studying is whiteness. We're really studying the construction of whiteness. Whiteness is about anti-blackness. And sometimes things are more explicit than others. So if you look at early Virginia texts, Virginia is maybe the most important colony in the United States in terms of slavery, and most of the early presidents from Jefferson on all came from Virginia. And we're getting ready to acknowledge the 400th anniversary of slaves coming to the United States. And despite what the governor of Virginia said, they were not indentured servants, they were slaves. But when you read, it's interesting. Part of the complexity is the nation state had not formed, and the nation state didn't have an official role, so it was kind of messy. So in that sense, you could give the governor a little slack. It's like the state had not really formed yet. It was in the process of forming. But that's the point, that the process of nation building was also the process of black making. Blackness as a social identity had not been constructed. It was in the process of being constructed. And if blackness as a social identity had not been constructed, it meant whiteness as a social identity had not been constructed. So the indigenous Europeans who came over, they were not white. Whiteness was being constructed. That construction took a long time. There was nothing natural about that construction. And eventually what Virginia said, literally, is that whiteness is not blackness. One of the early definitions of, so who's white? It means you're not black. That's what it means. Whiteness was derivative and reactive to whiteness, to blackness. And it still is. And so really what we're studying when we study anti-black violence, anti-state violence, we're studying whiteness, the construction of whiteness. And the hard edge, I believe, in terms of getting to a new place where this violence is not so dominant, means a reconstruction of whiteness. Reconstruction of whiteness. And I always hasten this when I say this because it sounds harsh. And it is harsh. But we're not talking about people who are phenotypically light-skinned. We're talking about an ideological social position of whiteness, which only existed at the same time that we were constructing the nation state. We constructed the nation state, especially in the United States, Brazil, and in Europe, for whites by excluding blacks. And what we're seeing now, at this moment in the United States, in Brazil, in England, in much of the world, is whites basically claiming a disruption because these immigrants who are not white, and we could say the colonialists in Europe and the United States, blacks and Latinos are claiming to be part of the we. So we've never had a healthy expression of society where blacks and whites were in concert with each other. Not because of blackness, but because of whiteness. And it's not clear to me that whiteness can coexist in a democracy with blackness. And I don't mean that in people who are phenotypically white and people who are phenotypically black. I mean the ideology of whiteness cannot necessarily coexist with blackness. Now think about this. So we have slavery. Then slavery ends.
Well, yeah, we'll watch the rest of that clip on another class. This whole speech is pretty amazing. So I want to read a couple, or one quote. Danielle says, "It's so interesting. As someone raised in Mexico, we learned at least as much about pre-Hispanic cultures as colonial times in elementary, high school." Yeah, we didn't. Yeah, at least at my schools didn't talk much about this kind of stuff. And what can I say, like, so he ends this on the question of like, he doesn't believe that we can have a democracy with whiteness and blackness together. I'd love to kind of open this up, and at this point, kind of, see, like, I mean, if anyone has any feelings or comments about that, or what do you think let me pose this question. What do you think he means when he said that last line, that, we're not, he doesn't believe there can be a democracy with whiteness and blackness? If anyone wants to unmute themselves, go for it, or just type in. All right. Well, I'll give it a little bit more longer in case anybody's working on typing something, but at least for me, I mean, like, feel free to join in. The idea of whiteness is the idea of this racial hierarchy with white supremacy on top. And if you have this racial hierarchy, if you have the systems of white supremacy, it's going to deny the participation of democracy with the people below on that racial hierarchy, the black people, black indigenous people of color. That video, that James Baldwin video we played in that first class, when he was debating, he was in England debating some English debater, and the question was, can the American dream be achieved with black people being denied it at the same time? And that was his ultimate premise is until we get past this white supremacy, until we accept our understanding, we're never going to have a real democracy where everyone can participate and be treated equal. But yeah, cool. There's a couple people added. Josh, I'd like to add something. Okay.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, hi. Professor Powell reminds me of, actually it's the first chapter of a book titled The Peculiar Institution. Kenneth Stamp, 1955. But what's interesting in the early history pre-Constitution of the US is that at that time, both blacks and whites were considered slaves. And there was no distinction based on race. And it was only when the founding fathers began constructing the language of the Constitution that they began to distinguish and demarcate the difference between a white slave and a black slave. Yeah, he reminded me of that part of Stamp's book.
But when you say white slave, are you referring to like white indentured servant?
Correct. Okay, folks who were sent over from Europe, from England largely, to the US in order to pay off their debt for having stolen a loaf of bread or whatever.
Yeah, and that's where we talk about the criminalization of poverty in England, where they passed all the blood laws, where they basically criminalize anyone trying to survive, and then they send them over. For sure. I mean, I would just suggest not to relate, the indentured servants to slavery, but in many ways there are a lot of similarities. Definitely, they're both forms of exploited labor as well. But yeah, definitely, yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. So Kristen writes, I think that is true up to the point where there is equal power with whites and blacks, which is inevitable just based on demographics. Cool. So yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thank you all so much. So we'll move on, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into aspects of whiteness and how it kind of plays out in our society. There was this really great article, Cared, Understanding Whiteness. It's a really amazing article, but it had this great list of different aspects of whiteness. And, we've gone over a lot of these already. Like, it was socially, politically constructed. It was, it was an ideology. It didn't, it wasn't based on skin color. It was mainly about positions of power. And it was relational to, it was relational, I can't say, sorry, relational to the white. White only exists in opposition to other categories, locations in the racial hierarchy produced by whiteness. And defining others, whiteness defines itself. As fluid, we talked about, has changed over time. Some people were considered white and not white, depending on, the time period and what was needed at the time. But I wanted to say the last one is a state of unconsciousness. Whiteness is often invisible to white people, and this perpetuates a lack of knowledge or understanding of difference, which is the root cause of oppression. I think that's really what the scariest part of all this stuff is white supremacy and whiteness. This ability to survive is directly contingent on its ability to remain hidden. And like I would say, I never even thought about any of this stuff until like the last decade in my life, to be honest, and just grew up, we never talked about these things in school. We talked about democracy, we talked about communism, we talked about capitalism, we talked about all these different systems, but we never talked about white supremacy. We never talked about the creation of whiteness. We never talked about any of these things, and it's very intentional to kind of perpetuate it. And a couple other things, it's based on privilege. We're going to have a whole section kind of diving into privilege. It's based on systemic and normative. But complicity, it's also based on complicity. So I'm going to read this Jamie Ute, this quote: "This club known as whiteness was designed to offer advantages, some small and some large, to light-skinned Europeans in exchange for their complicity in the theft of indigenous land and enslavement of exploitation of non-white people." So I think in order for, kind of join, like how a lot of people who had white skin but weren't considered white, they, in order to join this white, status, to get this white status, they had to be complicit with what was happening with the indigenous and enslaved Africans. And then the last part, again, about the invisibility. I just want to read the last part by Ijoma Olua. Let me know if I mispronounce it. I'm pretty sure, yeah, but Ijoma Olua, she wrote a really great book. So I think it's like, so you want to talk about race. She's awesome to follow on social media. There's so much good, she puts so much good content. But she wrote, "Your survival has never depended on your knowledge of white culture. In fact, it's required your ignorance. The dominant culture does not have to see itself to survive, because culture will shift to fit its needs." And then another part about whiteness is the internalizations. So our next class is going to be completely on internalizations. We're going to talk about stereotypes and biases and all the things that we all of us have absorbed into from this country. But dismantling racism. If you haven't visited that site, it's all my research, it's one of the best sites when it comes to like defining racism and white supremacy and resources and stuff. It's a really fantastic site. But I'm gonna read the top definition. Racism not only impacts us personally, culturally, and institutionally, racism also operates on us mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. When racism targets us, we internalize the targeting. When racism benefits us, we internalize that privileging. So when in this white supremacy society, we have not only internalized inferiority for people growing up in the white supremacy society who's not white, they internalize all the things that are thrown at them, and they internalize that as inferior feelings oftentimes. And we're going to talk. We're going to have a whole class on just the trauma that it can be inflicted from Black, Indigenous people of color growing up in a white supremacy society. And then on the other end, we have internalized superiority, where white people kind of internalize these different privileges and expectations. And some of them, I'll just read a couple of these, but one of them I found really powerful is this internalized white superiority leads us to believe that, I have a right to be comfortable if I'm not. And then whoever is making me uncomfortable is to blame. I think about that a lot when we talk about like white fragility, and we talk about, when we're talking about racism, especially when we're confronting, something that's racist, the part of that, like reaction that you get is oftentimes from people who, they believe they have the right to be comfortable, and they're angry at anyone that upsets that right, and that's something we really need to get past so we can start having real conversations about this. And a couple other things, I can feel that I personally earn through work and merit any and all of my successes. I grew up believing that we lived in a meritocracy, and then that, white people just had all the wealth because they worked harder, and Black people must just not have worked hard, and no one told me that, but they told me the idea that we were in a meritocracy. So I looked around at the realities of the world, and I came up with my own conclusions. And I think a lot of people do that as well. I have many choices, as I should. Everyone else has those same choices. And I think that's a big one I notice is a lot of white people feel that, the way they experience the world is the way everyone else's experience of the world. So they don't understand why people are complaining about police brutality, or why, people complaining about job discrimination or housing discrimination. And that's something, we need to get, past as well. And this is a big one. I'm not responsible for what happened before, nor do I have to know anything about it. I have the right to be ignorant. I think I saw a question. Can you repeat the sauce of this flight, please? Is the organization just called Dismantling Racism? Yes. It's a website. the organization that created the website, and the whole thing is called Dismantling Racism. If you just type that in Google, you should find it's just amazing resource website. I actually included on the pre-readings if anyone got the pre-readings. But if you can't find it, definitely send me an email. I'll send you a link to that. All right, so MTV did this really great segment about white people. It's like an hour long. We're just going to play the beginning intro. Just want to kind of identify the beginning intro that they asked, what it means to be white, and I just want to kind of elaborate on some of people's responses.
Trying to be careful here. Don't be careful. You kind of get this feeling that things belong to you. To be white is the good thing.
We don't even necessarily know someone that's not white.
People here don't see anybody of another race. So there's this barrier community.
If I bring up any sort of race issue with my parents, they immediately assume that I'm demonizing them.
I didn't want to feel like I couldn't live in this house with my beliefs.
When you start seeing things that aren't your own, no English, you don't speak, it's going to make you want to move away.
Any minority group, if they get a scholarship, straight white men feel like something is being taken away from them.
Kind of feels like I'm being discriminated against.
We've never had to internalize what white people have done in America, but here, you can't escape that.
I'm getting uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable.
Hey, this is great. Let's get all uncomfortable together.
All right. It's actually a pretty good episode. I definitely recommend checking it out. But I just wanted to kind of highlight, because these people were really honest with their answers. And I think, yeah, some of them, just highlighting some of them, because I think a lot of people share the same feelings, like the feeling that things belong to you, especially like I think about, how people think, white people think that, all the words belong to them. Like, a lot of white people don't understand why they can't say the N word, or how, like, all the spaces belong to them. They don't understand why there's some spaces that white people shouldn't go to, that you need to, so it's like the idea that things belong to you, and white is good and norm, and that people are and most people, I think if we look at segregation, most white people are living in these white bubbles where they don't, like, I think there's like 75% of white people don't have any friends of color, or if they do, it's not very powerful friends. Like this like quote down here: if you are a white person and have black friends that don't talk about white people in front of you, you don't have black friends. And I think that really means, that says a lot, because I've definitely been that person. And so we are in that bubble, and I think that's where we get a lot of misconceptions about what's happening in the world is from that segregation. So this is a long quote, but it's such a good quote. I'm just going to read it. I apologize if people are getting annoyed at my voice. But this is from Tracy Castro Gill. She wrote this article about countering whiteness, and I recommend reading the whole article. It's such a good one. But I'm just going to start from the top. Through laws, policy, and practices, white people have been taught to exchange their ethnic and cultural identities for the benefit of whiteness. Our history tells us racism is a result of whiteness, not of race. John A. Powell of the University of California, Berkeley, explains that being white was originally defined as not being black. In response to Bacon's rebellion and uprising of European indentured servants and black enslaved Americans in colonial America, elite Europeans created the white race to drive a wedge between the two groups and prevent further uprisings. This is when Europeans became white, giving up their ethnic and cultural identities, and whiteness became a sought-after power structure. White indigenous servants were still economically oppressed, but their new status brought with a sense of power and superiority. Thus, whiteness created racial oppression. This pattern has continued throughout our history in the United States. For example, the creation of the Federal Housing Administration restricted housing opportunities to white only. So people who were previously considered ethnic groups like Jewish Americans chose to forego identification as an ethnic group and instead selected whiteness. Ta-Nehisi Coates refers to this phenomenon as the people who believe they are white. Participation in this system requires the belief that being white is somehow outside of ethnicity, culture, and sometimes even race, creating an environment in which white people study racism as if it's something outside of their personal experiences. Using whiteness instead of racism puts the onus for action back on white people. So the last paragraph, I wanted to read the first two ones because I think they really sets the stage of everything we've been talking about. The last paragraph really kind of drives this really powerful point. I no longer talk about racism, but about whiteness. I define whiteness as the cultural values, norms, behaviors, and attitudes that uphold white supremacy. Words like culture, diversity, inclusion, equity, and even justice have been co-opted to avoid talking about race and racism. Using the term whiteness in place of racism directly counters this phenomenon and places accountability of white people by forcing them to look in the mirror and see how they are not only part of the problem, but central to systems of power and oppression. I have found when white people are consistently confronted with their whiteness, they are more likely to move from ally to accomplice in fighting whiteness. I really like that last paragraph. Just the idea of, because the racism has just been, I mean, people have just like kind of redefined that in so many different ways. And oftentimes it works against us when we're trying to explain that. But instead of saying racism, say whiteness or white supremacy. I think there's a lot of value to that, because that, you know, really drives home the real purpose of this, the real, you know, point of the racial hierarchy that this country has been built on. Yeah, Danny, the source, if you just type in Tracy Castro-Gill countering whiteness, you can find the full article. Sorry about that. That was a lot of reading. I try not to read too long articles. I just, you know, sometimes it's just like, I'm not going to be able to summarize, do justice. I just need to read this. So the last part we're going to talk about is white pride. This is, we need to understand, because I can understand, like, when we grow up, you know, like how I was born and the education I was taught, I didn't know any of this stuff. So when I thought about, you know, white pride, I thought, you know, I was just proud of being, you know, my white community, my white, you know, family, you know. But when we start understanding that, you know, whiteness was created as a part of a racial hierarchy, the very foundation of whiteness was created on racism and white privilege. It's suddenly you start understanding why it's not okay to be, you know, have white pride. It's not okay to be proud of being, you know, on the top of a racial hierarchy. You know, I mean, that's that you can still be proud. You can be proud of being Italian, proud of being, you know, Irish, all this ethnicity. You know, that is great. You know, just like, you know, having Black pride and Mexican pride, and having, you know, that these are all great things. You know, these are all things that are moving past like anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous cultures, and they're redefining their culture into something more beautiful and more profound. You can have all that, but just it's important to understand why white pride is just not okay. And that really, that's a tough thing. You know, like I said, if you don't understand the history of this, as most people were not taught it can be a really confusing thing. But once you understand the history, it makes a lot more sense, for sure. So someone posts, but Latino is not one culture. Black is not one culture. It can be African or specific country, Jamaican, Haitian, Brazilian, for sure. Yeah, you could definitely dive deeper into, like, you know, the ethnicities of these different, you know, and that's why, like, a lot of people, you know, they don't like, a lot of Black people don't like African American, because a lot of Black people, you know, more identify with, you know, Jamaica or Haiti or someplace. So it's, yeah. That's definitely a lot. That's why I was like, you know, I mentioned at the beginning, like, yeah, please help me, you know, when it comes to culture, if we need to add that to understand it a little bit better. But thank you for adding that, for sure.